And the member for Glasgow South at one stage said he didn't want to get involved in struggles with chimney sweeps, which seemed to somehow make a nod towards the concept of deterrence in that regard. However, he spent most of his speech, as is normal, I'm afraid, with contributors from the Scottish National Party, in attacking Labour Party policy and the Labour Party, more about internal politics in Scotland, I feel, than actually the national issue that we're discussing here today. Because I thought that the honourable member, the member for Llanelli, made an excellent speech reaffirming not only current Labour Party policy, but in line with the long-standing policy of the party and indeed the bipartisan policy of British governments of both parties. My right honourable friend, the member for Durham, drew attention to the record of the Attlee-Bevan government in developing the nuclear deterrent, not, as seemed to be implied, in some bombastic gesture, but actually in response to being cut off from nuclear information by the McMahon Act, where they had to make a decision as to whether Britain was going to maintain an independent capability, and made the right decision. We're discussing today the 50th anniversary HMS Resolution, built under the Wilson government, April 1969, when it first sailed under the Wilson government. Like the last Labour government, as again has been mentioned, resolution carried overwhelmingly in this House to renew that capability. And quite frankly, it's only a shame, as I've said in interventions, that the Cameron coalition government didn't go through with that, caused very considerable delay and dislocation, not only to the industry but also to the operation of CASD, and maintaining that with very considerably increased maintenance costs. And I have to say, quite frankly, that only reinforces my view of the previous Prime Minister, David Cameron, that deep down he was shallow, that there was very little that he believed in, and allowed himself, frankly, to be dragged around by the Liberal Democrats while they pursued all sorts of fanciful alternatives, maintaining a nuclear deterrent, but looking at other alternatives, whether land-based or cruise missiles. Very interesting today that while there have been genuine and quite proper disagreements as to whether we should have a nuclear deterrent at all, there has been no mention of all of these fanciful alternatives that were basically a way of just kicking the can down the road, which seems to be the default setting of the Conservative government since 2010 up until this day.
Just before he moves on, would you allow? I wonder if there is something we could agree on, and that was the decision taken by Cameron and Osborne to depart from Labour's practice of having funding for this outside of the defence budget. Does he think that was the right or the wrong thing to do?
The deficiencies of George Osborne's stewardship of the Treasury are ones on which I could wax lyrical, but probably not within the time that the Deputy Speaker would allow. If I can then move on to the broader issue. My right honourable friend, the member for North Durham, rightly drew attention to the view that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War rendered deterrence redundant, and also, indeed, much of conventional defence. And we had options for change with the huge dislocations, which, quite frankly, in 1997, when I came into the Defence Ministry, we were still dealing with the aftermath of that. But leave on one side anything about about the issues then. It is now absolutely clear that that complacent attitude is now no longer tenable. Threats, state and non-state, have increased, are increasing, and need to be confronted and contained. And threats are a combination, are they not, of capability and intention and doctrine. And what we are seeing from Russia is a worrying, alarming, increasing activity in all of those areas. We're seeing the clear development of a nuclear doctrine, including in short term, including in non-strategic nuclear from Russia with the Gerasimov doctrine. The report from the Defence Committee, Missile Misdemeanours, Russia and the INF Treaty, goes into some detail about the several breaches and continuing breaches of the INF Treaty by Russia, as agreed by all the NATO states at the recent meeting of NATO foreign ministers, making very clear that Russia is frankly tearing up that agreement, and indeed in response to the United States calling them out on this, Russia has also moved away from that treaty. That also, I have to say, may have some worrying implications for the START negotiations of the strategic weapons, and we should be arguing inside NATO, but also in other forums, for maintaining those discussions. If Ronald Reagan could come to many of these agreements, quite frankly, the United States now should be able to. But let's be clear who is the prime instigator in breaching these agreements, and that is Russia. And one of the things that worries me sometimes about some of these debates, including about the INF, it's very reminiscent to me of the time when of the cruise missiles issue and people campaigning in this country against cruise missiles. I always found it slightly perverse that people were more concerned about campaigning against the missiles that were pointing in the other direction, rather than campaigning against the SS-20s that were pointing in our direction, which were changing the strategic balance in Europe. And therefore that was why leading figures, leading social democrats like Helmut Schmidt, were arguing for the possibility of cruise missiles in order to maintain the balance, in order therefore to maintain peace in Europe, and showing resolution in that. And we're also seeing inactivities away from the nuclear field. We're seeing the preparedness to use force in Ukraine, in Georgia, and also in cyber attacks on the Baltic countries, and also in massive exercises within the regions of the Baltic countries. Because what we have to be clear is that while nuclear is awful and almost unimaginable, conventional warfare is also awful. Summed up by General Sherman in the 19th century, that war is hell. And yes, we all remember the tragedies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But also during that conflict, we were seeing the firebombing of Tokyo, in which hundreds of thousands died. The bombings of Hamburg and of Dresden, let alone the bombings on our own soil as well. Yeah.
Is he suggesting that indiscriminate bombing is actually okay and an acceptable part of warfare?
Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. To say that warfare results in devastation and huge loss of life, as indeed we are seeing in Syria today. And the honourable member for Worthing drew attention to the seminal work of Sir Michael Quinlan on nuclear strategy. One of the points he made very strongly in all of his works was that conventional warfare, particularly with modern technology, had awful consequences, exactly. And therefore that it is warfare that we have to be trying to contain and, if not abolish, and rather than just focusing on one aspect of warfare, that's the important issue that we have to address. And so maintaining the police, the peace, it's true, some believe that's achieved by disarmament, or indeed by pacifism. I would argue that history demonstrates that peace is better maintained by preparedness and vigilance. That is why continuous at-sea deterrence has been so critical in keeping the peace for the last 50 years, and also why we owe so much to those who operate it around the clock, those who build and maintain it around the country. It may be a silent service, but it's one that this anniversary gives us the opportunity both to acknowledge and praise.
Simon Clark. Thank you very much, Speaker. It's an absolute pleasure to follow what I thought was a really excellent